Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone to our next Plex session. This is on Plex tips and techniques. So today we're going to do 3 lightning talks covering a variety of useful tips and techniques that can be used in your Plex application to improve your applications. So the 3 speakers today is myself, Roger Griffith. I'm the Director of Software Development at Eagle Systems Products. We have Andrew Leggett. He's a senior software consultant with CM First, and Jeremy Stint, Programmer Analyst 3, United Heritage Financial Group. So I'm going to do the first lightning talk, a little bit about myself. I'm currently the president of the Plex 2E worldwide user community and widely regarded as the leading evangelist of Plex. So today I'm going to talk about how to replace those cryptic validation messages that you have in your applications, that we're going to replace those cryptic messages with meaningful messages that you specify. So just a little bit about the session. There's a few of the cryptic built-in validation messages that are in the pattern libraries as well as Obase that are confusing and plain awful. So this session is going to show you how to replace those messages with nice user-friendly messages that you specify. And this is done with just a couple of triples and there's no coding required. Okay. So validation messages. So the messages that we have, they are baked in. So they're generated with metacode specified in the pattern libraries as well as Obase. And the text of the message is fixed and it's cryptic. So we thought that you just had to live with these annoying messages because there's no message replaces message triple available to us. And to replace the metacode that's in the pattern libraries with your own metacode would be painful and a lot of work. And so what we found out is that there actually is a simple solution to this problem. And I want to give credit to Tim Broadstone from Eagle Systems Products. He figured out how to do it, and Tim is with us today. So thank you, Tim. Okay, so here's an example of what you'll have in a traditional pattern application. So in a situation where you have one entity that refers to another entity, the user typically has the option to key in the foreign key value. In this case, we have this entity refers to the module. It might be owned by module, I'm not sure. But the user has the option of just keying in a value. And if they key in the wrong value and the value that they keyed in does not correspond to your lookup table, then what you'll have is the user will get a message that says, there is no data for the values that you have entered. And it doesn't really specify which field it was. It's just kind of a generic message that says there's no data out there for the values that you entered. So what you have is you have a message that really makes sense to a developer, but it's not a user-friendly message to your end user. Here's a similar situation. If your application is developed in Obase, you have a similar cryptic message that says relation failed validation. There's no reference to which field it was. It's just the relation failed validation. So it's equally cryptic and makes sense to a developer, but not an end user. So here's a simple solution. So here's a situation where this is a pattern function. So you create a message. In this case, I scoped it to the edit suite of my entity, and it's just called invalid module. And the text of that message says invalid module. Your text can say whatever you want it to say, but the main thing is that you want it to be kind of relative to what the validation is. So, and the way you do this is you add 2 continuation triples to your entity. So in this case, the client notice type is owned by the modules. So we add a continuation triple that says sends, and then we reference the message that we just created. And another continuation triple says when. And when is based on the name. That's the part of the validate class library called relation check failed. So whenever it does that validation, it replaces the normal message with the message that you have specified here. So you're basically just pointing to a message. And the actual text of the message, in this case, I just got invalid module, but it could be something that's more specific to your situation. Okay, here's, in the case of Obase, you basically do the same thing. You create a message and add 2 continuation triples. You do your sends, and the when is a little different because the when is tied to the name from Obase called validation failed. So your final result. So on the left side is a pattern function. And so if the user keys in an invalid foreign key, the validation message says invalid module. On the right is a Obase function. The user keyed in an invalid foreign key, and in that case, the message is replaced with invalid program type because that's what I replaced it with. So anyway, it's very simple. It's you create a message and then a couple of triples to point to that message, and away you go. Okay, so any questions from the audience? Most of the audience being virtual today. It was that clear. That's the kind I like, where everything you wanted to know is there. Okay. Where do we start here? Okay. So is there a way to pass parameters? I don't know, but I doubt it. Because you realize you're just dealing with whatever the metacode is set for. The metacode, doesn't give you a place to go in and like map the parameters and this type of thing. So I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm just saying I don't know how you would do it. You got to hack the source code. So say that again, Jeremy. Let me give you the microphone.
Because the pattern function, what is this? Validate entity relations uses a ++ text defined. It won't support parameters. I think if there was a different line of metacode there, it might.
Okay, so parameters. Hello, it's very interesting. In which version of classes can we find these triples? So to my knowledge, this is available probably with any version of Plex. I don't know. I mean, we're on 7.1. I don't know how far back you'd have to go to not be able to use this. So it's unknown. All I know is we're on 7.1 and it's available. Yeah. Yeah, even classes 2.2. I'm going to say probably not, but man, God bless you if you're you're still able to make 2.2 work. No clue, no clue. We're on 7.1, and even 7.1 is not a supported version of Plex anymore. I'm very blessed. That's fantastic. Okay, so we're going to turn it over to our next lightning talk speaker here. Give me a second to move my little scooter. So let me get back. Hang on one second here. I have to officially introduce you. Okay. Yeah, help yourself there. So our next lightning talk speaker is from Andrew Leggett, and he is the senior software consultant with CM First, and he's been working with Plex since it was just a beta product over 25 years ago. He's worked for sign-on in both the US and the UK before settling in with CM First, where he works today. And he works with the CM WebClient, integrating along with training, mentoring, and consulting. And he's going to show you today debugging Plex applications in Eclipse. And I'm going to turn it over to Andrew. Let me get his.
Yep, thanks, Roger. Okay, and I'll just go full screen. Okay, so yeah, for those that saw the previous session, I did a brief debugging JavaScript. So now I'll be talking about debugging Plex Java using Eclipse. It's very, well, to me, it's very important to take a look inside the actual generated function to find out what's going on when you're debugging. You can stare at the action diagram as much as you want, but to actually find out, why something is failing, I just find it's very easy to go in to the generated code in Eclipse and inspect the function as it's running and see exactly what it's doing. So I'll just talk through a few hints that I've come across when doing this. So it's mainly focused around Eclipse and Java, though there are similar concepts for the other platforms. I've done line by line debugging in all those other platforms, C++, C#, RPG, etc. So some of these principles might apply to those, and it will be a bit technical, so just be aware that the slides and materials will be available after the conference download, so you can study at your own pace. So for web client and Java, I use the Eclipse IDE for building. I know you can build directly from Plex, but having Eclipse, which is a free open source IDE, just provides a whole bunch of tools and abilities that just make your life a lot easier. So from within Eclipse, you just have to watch out for this bug icon, and you'll see it in a few places. So if you're debugging a web client application, you can start debugging by just doing a restart in debug on the server tab, or you can click on the toolbar. And for Java client applications, you can run them from the toolbar at the top, and you just run it from the debug menu, which has the bug icon. And then once you've started in debug mode, then it will stop on breakpoints, etc. So breakpoints, the very first thing I'd recommend is that in your generate and build options, you turn on include comments in source. So what this does is it takes your action diagram comments and shows them as comments in generated code. It makes things a lot easier to read because Plex does its own thing when it's generating. So you can keep a track of where you are in your action diagram, just helps a lot. And to set a breakpoint, it's very simple. You just just double click in the left column. And whenever it's running the code, it will just stop at that point, and then you can stop and inspect the values. So just a few shortcuts there. F6 is to step line by line through everything. If you come across a subroutine, a go sub, then you just do F5 to step into, and then you'll step through there. And if you press F7, that'll take you out of the subroutine back to where that was called from, and you can continue from there. And if you want to pause debugging, you can still leave all your breakpoints in place. But there's a toolbar circle with a line through it, which you can use just to pause debugging. So a few options for conditional breakpoints. So let's say, for example, you're debugging a block fetch and you're interested in the very last row that gets added to your block fetch. You don't want to be stepping through 63 times while it's building up the fetch data variable. So what you can do is add a conditional breakpoint. And to do that, you just do a control, double click in the left column, as opposed to just the standard double click. And this will bring up an extra dialog. And there's a couple of useful options here that I use occasionally. Hit count, which is just a number of iterations it'll go through before it stops. So you can set that to say 63, and it'll go through that line 63 times and stop on the last one. And you can also add your own condition. So if you choose a conditional breakpoint, you can put in a Java comparison, and when that comparison is true, it will stop on that line. So once you're stopped on your breakpoint, you can just take a look and see what the values are. Now, Plex has its own internal representations of fields, but it's quite easy to figure out how it's doing it and seeing what the values are. So in this example here, I want to take a look at grid P, the user ID field in grid P. So Plex always does this v.get variable, and that's the name of the variable that it's working with. In this case, it's going to be grid P, and it's also got the name of the function it's in, and then dot, and then get, and it's going to be a Plex field, and it will be a get as, depending on the data type of the field. In this case, it's a user ID field. So I would just select all that with my mouse, and then you can press Control-Shift-I to inspect, or just do a right click and inspect. And you'll get a little drop down, it'll pop up and it'll show me the current value. And in this example here, the value is Abram, because this is one of the models he gave me. So alternatively, you can also take a look at the whole variable at the same time. So if I want to see every field that's in grid P, I just need to select the v.get variable grid P and do the inspect, Control-Shift-I. And it gives me a few more options from Plex's internal representation. But within that get variable grid P, there's an internal field called m variable fields, and it's a hash map. But if you select that, it'll give you all the fields listed by their implementation name, and then the values. So if you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see that it's showing all the values there. So that's very useful to see everything at once. And this will apply to any variable. So it can be a parameter for a function, a view, a region on a panel. All just works the same way. And you can also use expressions. And what this does is allow you to monitor several fields at the same time. So there's a tab at the bottom of the screen called the expressions tab. So you just select your field or variable and just do a right click and do add a watch. And what it does is it adds it to the expressions tab. And there's one extra feature of the expressions tab. You can use this to change values. So in the expressions tab, you have the name and the value of the field or object that you're looking at. You can add in your own JavaScript code, and it will evaluate as in the value. So here I'm adding the, I haven't got my pointer here, but in the middle row there, I have a dot from string Andrew at the end. And what that's doing is taking the string value Andrew and assigning it to that user ID field in grid P. and that value has changed internally. And if I carry on from that point, that's the new value for that field. So we'll see that in the grid when it's loading the grid. So that's the only way I've found of actually changing values while you're debugging. So that's a useful little hint there. Also, when you're debugging, it'll pause and it will show you the call stack. So working from the top is where it's currently stopped. And it's showing you, the current function you're in, what line number it's on. And I've got my breakpoint set on the position greater than or equal to in a block fetch. And as I work down, I can see how it got there. So I can see that there was a go subset fetch position. And then before that, it was being called from another function. So I can just go down this call stack and just click on one of those lines. So if I want to see the call statement, click on there and I can see what parameters were passed into the call at that point. And it'll go way back. So if you're trying to find out, let's say, what value has been written to a file, you can put a pause on the insert statement, and then you can see where that value was passed down by going through the call stack. So I use that a lot to investigate what's happening on the database. Another nice feature you can use in Java is logging. So in Java, there's several libraries for writing to a log file. So the user doesn't get to see this, but it's useful for developers. So if, for example, you're trying to find an issue in a production system, you don't want to be stepping through lines of code or putting up messages for the user to see. So you can write these messages to the log file. And the way these log file libraries work is that they assign a severity to the messages. So you can sort of choose what gets written to your log file. So if you want to see absolutely everything, you might set the severity to debug, and then all your debug messages will get written to the file. If you're only interested in errors, then you can set it to errors. So the benefit there is you have smaller log files, which is probably good for a production system. You don't want it to be writing debug messages all the time, but it's an option that can just be set in the properties file. So WebClient comes with a couple of methods for writing directly to the log file. So to add it, you just need a source code object, add an import to the WebPlex log class. And then there's some methods, trace log, which is effectively debug messages, info log, which is just information messages, and then error log, which for errors. So anything that you do in here will be written to the log file if your severity levels are set. Just a couple more shortcuts at the end. So if you're using Eclipse and you're looking for a file, everything is in subfolders and subfolders. You can navigate that way, but if you want to find a file directly and you know the name, just do Control-Shift-R. You get a dialog pop up, and then you can just, it auto completes as you type. So you can get directly to the file you want rather than having to navigate there. You just double click on it and it will open up in the editor. And finally, the Control-H, which is just search the entire workspace for a string. So might be useful for, I've got a big system, I'm getting a message going out to the users. I want to know everywhere where that message is used. I could try and find that from within the Plex model, but it's not always going to be accurate. So if I have the source code, I can just search for that message text in the workspace, and it'll show me all the functions where that message is. Also for your debugging database, if I know that a value has been written to a certain table, I know that I can just look for anywhere where that table, where there's an insert statement into that table. I can just put a breakpoint there, and then I can inspect, work out what happened before that to find out what where the strange error is coming from. So I think that was it. So, yep, that was the Java debugging. Is there a question here? Is there any logging included in the generated Java code? Not by default. So if you're using Plex messages, like debug message, log message, inquiry message, status message, then they'll just work as a client server. However, if you're using WebClient, there is a page template you can use. Now, I can't remember off the top of my head. I think it's weblog messages. But I think if you inherit from that page template, anything that's a log message will actually be written to a log file. So okay, yeah, so yeah, everyone's saying that any dialog message can be written to the log file as well. So hopefully that answers your question. So any more questions on Java debugging? If not, did you want to introduce Jeremy, or? So I will let Roger introduce Jeremy. Oh. Do you mean that is there a server-side log file to check? Yes, for WebClient, and you can specify that from your WebClient properties, and you can specify the logging level and what information gets stored in there, like the date and time and a few other things. But I don't think standard client server applications in Java, I don't believe you can do it without adding source code objects. Okay, so hand you back to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, so our next lightning talk is from Jeremy Stint. He is with United Heritage Financial Group, and he's going to talk to us about default build and INI. A little bit about Jeremy. He currently lives in Boise, Idaho. He works for United Heritage Financial Group. He's been a Plex developer since about 2000, working in Texas, South Carolina, Georgia, and now he's here being Boise, Idaho. He enjoys many of the Plex 2E conferences and gatherings where he's learned a lot. And he hopes to be able to share some ideas on how to boost usability for other Plex developers. And Jeremy's a regular speaker at our conferences, and he always has some great insights on things that he's doing that no one else has ever done before. So a little bit about his session abstract. He's going to show you how to set up your default options for working with new models and new INI files when you build an EXE. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy.
Thank you, Roger. So, as Roger has mentioned, I'd like to go over setting up the defaults. A little bit of history for this. When I make a new local model, either the previous ones come corrupt or I've lost it or something's happened, I've always got to go through and go set up the various options. I want this source code to go to that library and this one to go to a different source file. And I want to use, Roger's provided all of us with those linker options to turn on to make the C clients look a bit different. Got to go in and put in the linker options and do the other stuff. So that can be tedious and you almost always forget something. So what I was trying to do is find a method that I wouldn't have to do that. Wouldn't have to spend the time, wouldn't have to go through and remember every little setting to do. And I did find, well, the ways I've tried this before is just copy a BLD file from the previous model, which generally works, but if you're handing off to someone else new, they might not think to do that. There's also setting up each time, which, as I said, doable. You don't have to do it that often, but it can be error prone. And then you can just change the default file, which I have found after you've run Plex once, it makes a copy of the default BLD file in your user profile. So you could have a corporate one that gets installed in all developers' profiles or not. Places it can make a difference. You can preset every single value on the build directories. I believe you can preset these options. I don't do C++ much myself. I tested it and it seemed to work. You can preset those options, the editor options. One I like to turn on, well, not that one. These ones I haven't tested, but I believe you can probably preset all of these in the default BLD file. The generator options, I like to have extra resource directories. I like to turn on usage triples. You can preset that so you don't have to remember which bits go in your resource directories. The name allocation parameters you can't preset, but hopefully that's configured for the model. You can configure if you want to, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend this. You can preset a parameter file. But since you probably want a different parameter file per group model, that might not be a good idea. System directories, definitions. You can even come in here and poke at these values. For a while, I thought you couldn't set the use pre-built libraries checkbox, but I finally found it in a completely different section of the build file. So you can even preset that one, as well as your libraries and your header directory and your linker options. All of these can be set in your default BLD file. So when you make a new local model, they're just there. You don't have to go through and set them all. Especially if you've got lesser experienced Plex developers in your shop, you may want to just give them a default file, and anytime they make a new local model, the values would be set. I mean, it's useful as a corporation to keep a list of what gets set, but that way you don't have to go through and do it for every local model. INI file. There is also a default INI file. In researching this talk, I learned something. I learned that Plex modifies it every time you run Plex. So there's sort of two default files. There's the one in the Plex directory in the program directory. And every time, apparently, it copies that one or compares that one with the one in your models directory. And for whichever model you open up, it takes your current system configuration, your production box, your dev box, your remote gen and build box, and merges that in. So if you want to make changes, the best place is probably the one in the program files, and let's let it merge it on through. But that way you can pre-configure whether you want to use which type of controls you want to use, the WinC or the WinWidgets for the combo boxes, you can pre-configure those. If you've got a directory list for your programs where you've got some support libraries that everything uses, a date selector, some calculation conversion functions, you can pre-put that path in your DLL and P&L path. You can pre-configure if you've got a splash panel that you want to look different, you can pre-configure the options in there. And anytime you make a new EXE, it will create the INI with the new EXE with those default values. So if you're a company that tends to spin up lots of little programs, you've got the program for the accountants, the program for the salespeople, the program for the administrators, another department gets another 2 programs, then this way you don't have to copy someone else's INI and extract the bits that aren't relevant and put in new bits and double check it all. It will just build it automatically from the defaults. So those are a couple things I've found. They are helpful. They do seem to speed things up. It's something I thought I hadn't learned about before. I don't know if other people already knew these or if it's just one of those pieces that's buried in the help files and everyone just puts up with manually setting it every time. But I figured if we can improve our stuff, it's not a big improvement, but it can help, especially if you've got junior developers who don't do this, don't make a new local model, but once every 4 months. Well, if you can have defaults that they don't have to remember, these are the 4 things I've got to set or the 20 things, depending on how complex your environment is, then that can save your developers time and headache because why isn't this working? Well, did you set your resource directory? My what? well, some of us are used to the resource directories and some of us aren't. So were there any questions about any of this? Can you do this in Plex 7.1? I believe so. I suspect this has been in there since Plex 2 or something, based on how some of those help file pages look. I just never really studied or learned about it before. So as far as I know, it goes back from before it was called Plex. And we just said Obsidian there. So were there any other questions about this? Anyone? Sorry, I've walked too far forward. Anyone on camera there? Nope. Okay. Was there another one after me or? Okay. Abram's volunteering to, if we've still got time, Abram's volunteering to do another quick one. So, lots of us have met the charming Abram Darnutzer, who works for CM First and fixes problems for all sorts of customers. Okay, it's not my laptop, but do you have a slide deck or just a?
Yeah, I have a slide deck.
That way you can use the slide advance.
Take over my screen now.
You're sharing.
Right, so, just gotta pack as
Would you
much
like me
stuff
to
as
move
we
that?
Possibly can.
I can move that to you. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, everyone. I don't get a cool introduction, but that's fine. I'm very comfortable with myself. My name is Abram Darnutzer. I am a senior developer at CM First. So Andrew is not the only senior developer, regardless of what his bio said. And how do I hide this? Just get off the screen. Okay, so I have a very, very small item to talk about. It's called variant fields, and it's something that I did not know was a feature in Plex for a long time until I really started writing a lot of very, very generic patterns. And it kind of was a lifesaver once I figured it out. So Plex with parameter mappings is by design very restrictive. Everything kind of has to come from the same base components for you to be able to map into things. And that makes sense why it is that way. You don't want somebody to be able to map a character field into a numeric field and then everything blows up at runtime. So especially with numerics, it makes a lot of sense. Character fields, less so. I mean, it's all just a bunch of characters. But the only problem is anytime you have a pattern, you need to have like versions that can handle all the different field types that go in. And so because of that, in past models, I've seen lots of duplicated code when someone's trying to do one very generic thing just so they can make it work for the different things. Well, I mean, I guess that's the only way we can do that. Oh, wait, no, there's a better way. So I did not know this existed, but until about like 4 years ago, but there is a variant field type, which is just a simple triple. And essentially all it does is it's a generic field type that can allow anything to map into it. And so if you already knew about this and you didn't tell me, I'm very upset with you. But if you didn't know it, now you learned something new. So just as an example, and this isn't a super realistic real world example, it's just something I threw together in 2 seconds. I have this source code object. Sorry, let me actually show it first. All it does is get what the third character of what you put into it is. And as you can see right here, I'm just inputting a long description, so a character field. But if I want to do this for numerics as well, I want to see what the third numeric is or whatever, obviously I would need to make a different version unless, and I can now just change this for you. And let me put this down so I can type real quick. Okay, so all I did here was replace that long description with a field called myVariant, which I just gave a type sys of variant. And so now in this function, I have in the input, I have a surrogate, which is a numeric and a long description. And before I could only map, because it's a long description, I could only map the input long description in. But because I just did that variant triple, and I'll refresh. Now you get to see I have every field that is possible in the action diagram. Again, I know this is something very simple, but it's, as with a lot of things in Plex, there's a lot of stuff kind of buried in there that if you don't use it in your day-to-day development life, you either forget about or you just never knew about in the first place because no one showed you. And this is, I think, definitely one of those things. So I hope this can really help someone in the future when they're developing some patterns. If there's any questions on any of that. If not, thank you, everyone. I think Andrew has a presentation in what, 10 minutes? No, 20 minutes on replatforming. So please stick around for that. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. All right. See you in a little bit.